Welcome, everyone, to Polycarp's Paradigm. My name is Eric Robinson, and I have the wonderful privilege of being joined today by Arland Nichols. Arland is the president and founder of the St. John Paul II Foundation, and we met a few weeks ago through a mutual friend, and I found out more about the John Paul II Foundation and was just fascinated by it. And as I have a marriage coming up in my own life, he was talking about his marriage and his family with 8 kids, a ninth on the way, and just the beautiful work he's doing through the foundation with enriching married couples. And so wanted to invite you, Arland, on the podcast. Welcome. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, that'd be great.
Sure, Eric. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you and with your audience. So, I am president and founder of the St. John Paul II Foundation. But the most important thing about me, you already shared, right? That I have 8 children. My oldest is 14, and my ninth is on the way. So we'll have 9 at 15 and under here in not too long. So blessed to have a bustling family. I always say it's a fun, crazy, joyful mess, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. So that's the most important thing about me. By trade, I'm a moral theologian, bioethicist. That's my area of expertise, my love. But blessed to run the St. John Paul II, to be the president and founder of that organization, and to work with a great team of people committed to serving married couples, to serving our clergy and medical professionals. So.
That is awesome. Yeah, and the main thing I really want to touch on is this new initiative you have, Together in Holiness, that is specifically for married couples. But before we get into that, if you wouldn't mind just giving a brief background on what exactly is the St. John Paul II Foundation, what do you all do, and how does that all work?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the St. John Paul II Foundation is a Catholic nonprofit based here in Houston. And what we do is we partner with dioceses all across the country to provide continuing education in 3 different areas. One is for our priests, helping our priests teach and provide pastoral care on life and family issues. And that's an initiative called Shepherd's Heart. The second initiative is called Converging Roads. And Converging Roads is a continuing education program for medical professionals, helping doctors, nurses, chaplains, administrators to bring their faith and to bring their ethics into the practice of medicine, with that great conviction, right, that good medicine is ethical medicine and ethical medicine is good medicine. And then our third initiative is Together in Holiness. And I know we'll speak more about that, but Together in Holiness, in short, is an initiative that has 2 parts. It has a conference series and an ongoing formation series, really helping couples to thrive in their marriage and not just survive their marriage, and helping them to bring the church's beautiful and rich teaching into the day-to-day realities of family life. So Together in Holiness is our third initiative. We partner with dioceses all across the nation. This year we have 26 conferences nationwide. And that's post-COVID, right? So after a year and a half of kind of, slowing down, we're still quite busy. That's a lot of events in a given year. And blessed to do so with some great dioceses, great bishops, and great officials of different dioceses nationwide. So that's what we're up to. I'm blessed to do it here from the great state of Texas here in Houston. So
Yes, that is awesome. And so what in your personal life, like how did you start, having a reverence for Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul II?
Yeah, so I'm definitely part of that so-called John Paul II generation, right? And he was the only Pope I knew until 2005 when he died, and Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, became Pope. So my first encounter with St. John Paul II, who became Pope in 1978, was when I was a young singer. Actually, I still do music ministry today, even, but my first encounter with him was as part of a feature choir who sang during Holy Week at the papal audience, and he came up. And, I was in the 3rd or 4th row. I mean, that's as close as I got to him, was 3rd or 4th row, and but just always remember that. And for me in particular, even to this day, his countenance, his eyes. I mean, you knew this man who fearlessly and unfailingly proclaimed the truth. You could always tell that he loved you, right? And you felt like he loved you, right? It wasn't just this generic love everybody kind of thing. It was he loved the human being in front of him. And so for me, it's always, that's why I would say he's our patron. We're named after him, and we are furthering his passion and his love and his commitment to proclaim the truth in love. I'm so privileged, so blessed to be able to do that.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
And my listeners are pretty well aware, I think, at this point, that I became Catholic 6 years ago. And one of the biggest influences on me becoming Catholic was actually the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which was promulgated by St. John Paul II when he was Pope. Yeah. And then every single thing I've read since then, every encyclical I've read, studying theology of the body, I've just been blown away. And so just incredible. And so how do his teachings, especially theology of the body, really inform the way you teach married couples and the way you lead this foundation and spread the teachings of JP2?
Yeah, and I want to answer that, but something you just said, don't let me forget the answer. The very first thing I read of his when as a free man, right, as an adult, was my freshman and sophomore year in college. I read his document on the family, Familiaris Consortium.
Yes.
He wrote in 1981. And really that really answers your question. I mean, that set a course and a trajectory for me as a 18-year-old, 19-year-old, whatever I was at the time, to really, if I was going to go down the route of marriage, if I was called to that vocation, to really take seriously the call that was mine, and to shape my own marriage and shape my own relationship with whoever would be my bride, right, in line with the church's incredible and rich and beautiful teaching. So really, of all the documents, I would say that document actually is the most formative for our Together in Holiness initiative. And actually, it provides in a lot of ways the structure for that curriculum. Of course, theology of the body, and especially in areas of sexuality and this sort of thing, is always woven in. I mean, it's just kind of always there, right? Mm-hmm. But that Familiaris Consortio, where John Paul described the family as domestic church.
Yes.
The family as a school of love, a school of virtue, a seedbed of vocations, so on and so forth. He gave us all these incredible catchphrases. And so what Together in Holiness does is, so the conference series, it takes one of those phrases as its point of departure and our point of focus for a 2/3 day long retreat / conference. And we ask, what's the teaching? And then practically, how do we implement it in the home? What does it look like, for example, to pray with your spouse? And then thirdly, it's that mission going forth. Okay, here is what we are going to do. Husband and wife in this conference together, we've made a decision to do X, Y, and Z in our home going forward. And so it's a journey into St. John Paul II's teaching and how to bring, what is it, and then how to bring it into the day-to-day realities of family life. So of all the things, anyway, to answer the question, of all the things that influence that curriculum, if you will, the most, it's John Paul's teaching on family and Familiaris Consortio, also in his letter to families, and of course, as you mentioned, the theology of the body as well, especially when we do a School of Love. You'll hear a lot of theology of the body kind of language, as well as School of Virtue there. So, and that's just the conference series I just described. I didn't even share with you, the formation series yet, but that's the conference series. So.
Yes. Well, I would love to unpack a little bit about that. And as much as you're willing to share about your own marriage and family life, your experience, because as someone who's about to get married in less than 2 months, my goodness, I want to just get as many advice. I had Trent Horn on the podcast a few months ago, and he just downloaded some good advice to me. And so I think one of my favorite descriptions of the family life that you already mentioned is the domestic church.
Sure.
And I guess the father really being that priest of his house, the head of his family. How how do you live out that reality, and what is the vision of that being the domestic church, and how is it practically lived out? How have you been able to incorporate it in your own life, that vision of being the domestic church?
Sure. Um, oh, first of all, I mean, I'm just like anybody else,
Yeah.
right? I'm fighting and struggling and striving, right? I certainly don't hold up myself as a model of, of idyllic fatherhood and being a great husband. My wife would probably be the first to say, Arlen's got some work, and deservedly so. But no, I mean, for me, the first thing is recognizing that our homes have to be a place where the gospel is lived and where it's encountered, where something different is happening in this home. There's something
Mm,
set aside in this home by the way in which we go about our lives and the way in which we make decisions. So prayer, right, is a regular and natural and normal part of family life, where love is taught. I mean, the first vocation, the most fundamental vocation of the human person is to love, right? To make a gift of oneself. If that's not learned in the home, it's very difficult to learn anywhere else. If we can't do it in the home, even though it's the most difficult place to do it, right? If we can't do it in the home, we will be a resounding gong in the world, right? And so that being that school of love, being a place where it is lived and where it is learned, where a gift of self is truly pursued and sought after, where the faith is taught, so it's a place of evangelization. I mean, all of these kind of phrases that John Paul gave us encapsulate this domestic church. We are called to proclaim the faith in and out of season. And that means we have to be learning the faith. We have to be living it in the way in which, with our children, especially when we have children, and teaching and learning from one another. So these are just some hallmarks, I would say, of a school of love. Certainly, being a domestic church. Certainly, there's a lot more, and there's a lot of theological depth there that might bore our audience a little bit. But in terms of the practical thing, I think it really is being, as Pope Benedict said, a gymnasium, right? Where it's lived and learned and practiced, right? Where it's intellect, where it's body, where it's spirit and soul, where the whole person is engaged in living the faith, and being that person who is called to love and called to union with God. And the last thing I would say is this, and is the most important thing that you can ever remember in your ministry, in your life, in your marriage, is it's all about one thing. At the end of the day, only one thing matters, right? And that's sanctification of souls, heaven. At the end of the day, the one thing we're called to is to be saints, and the home is where that is a gymnasium for that, right? To become saints and to sanctify one another. If you keep that first in your marriage, if I keep that first in my marriage, our listeners do the same. I think we will be on a great path, even though there'll be mistakes along the way, right? And plenty of opportunities to say I'm sorry and to say I forgive you, as Pope Francis has mentioned. But if we remember that sanctification of souls is the single most important thing, and the only thing at the end of the day that matters, we will, I think, be on a good path towards a strong and beautiful marriage.
yes, yes. And I love that description of the family being the school of love. And actually, it was John Paul II really helped change my paradigm about what even love is, and just love being that total gift of self, which is even explicated in the Second Vatican Council and all of that. But
Right.
that just his emphasis on like the gift of self, it just blows my mind how simple that is, but how profound that is. That love is this total gift of self that makes so much sense of the God who is love. Of course, when he becomes man, he gives his whole self to us on the cross. And that's made present to us
Mm-hmm.
every time we go to Mass in the Eucharist. He gives us his whole self. And so how do you teach that in your family, like that school of love? Like, is it your kids watching you be a gift to your wife and a gift to them? And how does that look like? And uh, yeah, well, how do you foster that culture of love, that school of love in your home?
Sure. And by the way, one of the phrases for our conference series, as well as our ongoing formation series, is the family is a Trinitarian community. And so it's what you were just referring to, that Trinitarian community is love, right? And so we're called to be, and we are, an imprint of that in the world. So how do you go about that? I mean, yes, of course, the first place, we have to be models for these things. As Paul VI said in his document on evangelization, Pope Paul VI said, young people will listen to teachers if they are first witnesses. And so parents have to be a witness to love. But also in terms of parenting, I've got some of my own theories. In some ways I think through this, but I think we have a tendency to err in a lot of different ways as parents. We either seek to pacify our children, or perhaps we negotiate with them or threaten them, right, to get the outcomes we want. And so I always encourage parents, and I'm always trying to remind myself, and I do need those reminders often, to not parent for outcomes, but to parent for virtue, right? So, the classic easy example is your kid's screaming his head off at mass, right? And so you give him a sucker in the middle of the pew, right? And to get the outcome that you want. And kids are going to cry, and there are times in which we do have to quit. It would be a bad situation, or it'd be rude, right? But we have to be really careful not to just threaten that kid. If you don't behave, if you don't stop fighting with your sister, no donuts, right? Immediately and every single time. And all they're ever motivated by is that threat, right? And to avoid the negative outcome of not getting donuts, right? Or on the positive side, right, of they start to cry so that they can, because they know you'll pacify them, right? And you'll give them the sucker every time just to keep them quiet so you don't get embarrassed as a parent. These things are difficult and a challenge, but we have to be really careful of doing things like pacifying, threatening, and negotiating. I always say never negotiate with terrorists. Do not allow children to hold you hostage. And we've all been in those situations, especially when it's public setting. So instead of pacifying, negotiating, or threatening, really encouraging virtue. And the highest of the virtues, of course, is love. And so why do you not hit your sister, right? It's because you love her, and your job as a brother is to protect her, right? That's your the most important job, right? Is to be a Saint Joseph for your little sister or your big sister, right? And it's because you love her that you do that. And you teach that sort of thing instead of making it be so that your toys aren't taken away or that you're in timeout. Hey, we do timeout, and there are times for punishment, but it always has to be both and, right? And there's always that opportunity to raise, to have a lesson of virtue, right? In raising our children. So, those are just some initial thoughts, and certainly I don't have the silver bullet, as it were, for how do we become a school of love? But my conviction is very much to don't focus on outcomes. Instead, focus, even though outcomes are obviously important, right? But instead focus on virtue. When you focus on virtue, when you put the first thing first, the outcomes will come naturally and in time. And you model, right, by being patient, for example, right? By being patient with your children and having that conversation that maybe takes a little bit more time and takes a lot, at times can take a lot of patience. You modeled exactly what you're trying to teach and form in your children. And then they become actually virtuous. They're more likely to become, I should say, virtuous men and virtuous women, women who truly love rather than who do what you want them to do for the sake of some outcome, or negative to avoid it, or positive to gain it.
Wow. So yes, if your child is screaming in mass and you don't want to pacify them or threaten them or negotiate, but you do want to lead them to virtue, and also you want the outcome of them to be reverent in mass,
Sure.
What would you do in that situation? Would you take them back and say, hey, this is, and what if they're not even of the age to even understand you really? And I'm just curious, how does that work?
Yeah, no. So the intellectual argument I learned early on, doesn't always work with the 2-year-old, right? The appeal to the intellect doesn't always work. But habits are formed even at that young age. And so, of course, everything always has to be age appropriate. And we always have to discern that. I have one kiddo who is just always just the intellectual argument has always worked, for him. And he's just so convicted and so convinced. And he's kind of like me as a youngster. But that's not normal, right? I mean, that's not typical. So what do we do in that setting? One, I would say this to parents. He's not as loud or she's not as loud to everybody else as he is to you, right? That's the first thing, right? So relax, right? And it's when you get stressed that things start to elevate. So allow yourself to recognize that it's not as bad as it seems to you, because you're a mom and you just hear them in a different way, or your dad and you hear them differently than the people across the church do. Second thing I would say is, obviously there is some level of decorum and respect. When a kid is losing his mind, you do have to take the child out, and that's okay. And so you take the child out. Oh man, we just lost power here for a second, so I hope I don't lose you.
Oh, I gotcha.
Yeah. If so, that's what happened. But we will definitely take the children out when it's necessary to do so, especially in that young age. But we as a family have really made it a concerted effort not to do the whole daycare thing during church, but instead to allow our children to listen and learn and to watch. We always sit in the very front. The kids are so much better when they're in the front, especially at at any age, but particularly at a young age. It seems to pacify them because they're fascinated by incense, and they're fascinated by the flame. And they're fascinated by statues, right? So sitting towards the front. But yeah, I'm not a big fan, and I would discourage families. I mean, it's an opinion. But I would discourage, families from doing the food thing in mass. It's really hard to end that once you start. And I do think it probably begins to create some habits and some ideas that aren't helpful. It's probably better to go ahead and take your children out of mass, let them calm down, and then come back in. That's an opinion thing.
Right.
I wouldn't say that, but I would say that our experience has been that when we don't kind of pacify with the food at church, that window of time in which they are in the age where they might lose their minds during church becomes a lot shorter. But when you're pacifying with the food, it can go on for years and years. I think that's my experience personally, as well as talking to other families. So I don't know, no gospel there, but just some practical ideas.
That's great. And so now with marriage, what is your advice to like young couples or newlyweds or those who are discerning marriage? What are some of the first things that people that are, let's start with those who are discerning that vocation. What are some things key elements that, man, if you really got to know this, and here's some great advice in that path.
Well, I would encourage people to do what I did and read Familiaris Consortio. I mean, it's an incredible document. I do think we first of all have to know what marriage is and what it's not. And especially in our modern world, we have a tendency to kind of think only in terms of the relationship, right? And marriage is, of course, one side of the coin is marriage is a relationship between husband and wife, where gift of self and all this, all the good, beautiful thing. But on the other side of the coin, marriage is something, right? With or without you, marriage is something, right? And so you are entering into that thing. And so what would be some of the key things I would tell somebody? Discern well in dating, right? Make sure that you in dating are living a virtuous and chaste life, that you have conversations that matter. I'm a big fan. That's one of my phrases I say all the time. Have conversations that matter with your future spouse, or with the person that you're dating, even if you don't know she's going to be your spouse or he'll be your spouse yet. Have conversations that matter. My wife and I we'd sit out on the porch swing at our family's home, and it was always, we tell family, we're talking about life, love, and the priesthood. Because I was discerning entering the seminary. So we were always having conversations about life, love, and the priesthood. So that's one thing, date well, and have those conversations that matter early on. I guess the other thing is, I think one of the key elements to talk about is family life and having children. And I think there needs to be, and St. John Paul II highly encouraged, right? And the church teaches a profound openness to human life, a recognition that each child is a living I love you, is a walking and really a permanent manifestation, because of the soul given by God, a permanent manifestation of the love that husband and wife have. And there may be times in our lives in which we're not called to have children, right? And we have to discern that for serious reasons or grave reasons, as the documents say. But it does need to be serious or grave reasons, and for which we don't have children. It doesn't mean everybody's called like me to have 9 kids. Everybody's different. Every family's different for all kinds of reasons. But having that profound openness to human life, I think, is such an important part of marriage and family life. And so even in dating, you want to make sure that the person that you are marrying, the person you're engaged to, that y'all have that conversation or on the same page about that profound openness to human life. So those are 2 things I would say: date well, and then also that openness to life. I think a lot is revealed through that alone.
Yes. And now what about advice for someone like myself who's about to enter marriage? So what about for those first few years of marriage? Maybe, we might have a child 9 months, later after the wedding. We'll see.
Yeah.
Obviously going open to life completely and surrendering that to the Lord, and really excited to do that. But we don't know when the Lord's timing will be. But for those couples entering into marriage in like that first year, second year, like those early foundations, how can we set strong and amazing foundations, like the trajectory towards holiness?
Yeah. I mean, I can't answer that well without mentioning our Together in Holiness
Yes.
series. And the reason why it comes to mind here is that, just for our audience, our Together in Holiness formation series is really focused for those who are beginning in that early phase of marriage and family life. When you're making those decisions and setting those habits that will really set a trajectory for your marriage for the rest of your lives together. And so to my mind, it's so important to begin to set that trajectory, to chart that course that will really allow you to thrive in your marriage and not just survive it. And one important element of that is to doing marriage and family life in community with other like-minded families. We can't just go it alone. It is this world, the increasingly anti-religious, the increasingly secularized world, is and Satan himself is coming after marriage and family life. The first thing he attacked was marriage, right? And that will never stop in our lives. So attaching ourselves and being related to, or having a deep community of other couples who are on the same page as you, is so important. And that's where our Together in Holiness formation series comes in. And that's, Together in Holiness, if I may, just for a moment, share a little bit more about it. The formation series involves training of host couples, exercising that gift of hospitality, inviting to the home, most commonly, friends who are of a similar phase of life, a natural community. And during that time together, you share a meal together. There's a brief 6.5-minute, beautifully done video. And there's reading and Q&A and questions and conversation. And so the real work happens with 5 couples across a dining room table and a glass of wine, asking, hey, gosh, it's so awkward for me to pray with my wife. Like, okay, you're doing it. How did you overcome that awkwardness? How did you get started? Where do we get started? And the next time you get together, you're asking that, hey, how'd it go? Well, this worked, this didn't work. Okay, now try this, right? And, and so on and so forth. Oh gosh, I'm trying to teach my kids patience, right? And they keep acting up in mass. How do we handle this? How do we handle that? and you have conversations that matter across a dining room table in a stable community of friends who are on the same page as you and who are striving for the same things. So to me, I mean, that's my answer to your question.
Yes.
Even in my own life, I experienced it in informal ways. This is a way to formalize that sort of thing. And so we're blessed to have this formation series for thousands of people beginning this year, actually, all across the nation. So
That's incredible. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious to Christians, I think, all over the map, just how much marriage and families under attack these days. So how do we paint that vision of the Catholic marriage or the Catholic teaching on marriage? Because it is such a beautiful vision, and oftentimes it gets misinterpreted by the culture as restrictive or just stifling. But when in your experience, like, actually it's filled with joy, it's filled with life. And so could you just spend a few moments just painting that picture of the Catholic vision of marriage and family life, and how that is different than the culture's understanding of marriage and family life?
yeah. Well, the first thing is, as you were speaking, that immediately came to mind is there are many Psalms that say this or something to the effect of it, but the precepts of the Lord gladden the heart. And gosh, for some reason, you know, whatever the reason is, we tend to think of them as restrictive. But the reality is that when we embrace the precepts of the Lord, when we embrace what the church teaches about sexuality, about contraception, about love, about, I mean, just whatever that teaching is, it brings great joy. It brings freedom to live within an incredible call to actually become what we are called to be, as St. John Paul II, or become what we are, as John Paul II said. So the first thing is that sober recognition that freedom comes and joy comes through embracing fully the precepts of the Lord, to embrace fully the church's teaching. If you don't have that conviction, nothing else will make sense. It's just punishment. Even if you follow obediently, right? You know, but you experience it as a punishment almost. You have to recognize that the precepts of the Lord actually bring joy, bring love, bring happiness to a marriage and family, fulfillment to a marriage and family. So that's the first thing I would say. I'm forgetting the rest of your question now.
Catholic, yeah, kind of the Catholic vision of marriage as opposed to the culture at large.
Okay, so one good example, I think so much of the culture sees marriage and family life as what I get out of it, right? And we see, by the way, we see liturgy oftentimes in the same way, right? What did I get out of liturgy, right?
Yes.
I'm convinced, as an aside real quickly here, that a beautiful marriage and family ministry and a beautifully done liturgy that recognizes that it's for the salvation of souls and sanctification, glorification of God. That's the key to a healthy and beautiful parish life. But it's in short, it's not about you. You know, I mean, I when I taught high school, I would, my first class, I would say that to the students. It would always shock them. It's not about you. And when you recognize it's about living a life for others, I think it makes all the difference in the world. So that's probably the biggest, I mean, at least off the top of my head, that's probably the biggest difference is the society sees marriage as about your fulfillment, what I get out of this thing. And no longer get what I'm looking for, right? Maybe it's fun, maybe it's love, maybe it's sexuality, sex, right? Maybe it's, I don't know, you know what, there's all kinds of goods that are desired. But if we think it's about me and what I get out of it, we have forgotten the whole thing. It's not about my spouse making me happy. It's not about what I get, but rather, as we already talked about, it's about what I give, right? And it's that opportunity to give a gift of self. And we work out our salvation with fear and trembling within the confines of the home. That is where it happens. If we're called to marriage, that is the place. It's not at the church. It's not in a job in the first place, even though those are places in which we do that. the primary and first place we do it is in the home, working out our salvation with fear and trembling, making a gift of ourselves. That idea is so foreign to the culture, so foreign to the culture. And so, just to answer with one answer, that's it right there. I mean, that's the big difference between how society sees marriage and family life and how we as Catholics see it and are called to embrace it more and more fully each day. And if I may say this, none of us are living that perfectly right now, right? And none of us are when we enter into it. So don't lose hope when you don't do it perfectly, when you make mistakes. And instead, just like all the saints do in their lives, pick themselves back up again, right? Ask for forgiveness, whether it's needed in a confessional or whether it's needed one-on-one with your spouse or both, right? Ask for forgiveness, readily forgive, and move forward with that same goal in mind, which is salvation of souls, sanctification of the faithful.
That is incredible. Now, what about the role as the distinct roles of man and woman in marriage, and the man being the head of the family? What does that really mean? How have you been able to live that out? Because that can often be perceived negatively in our culture too, of like, oh, you're the head of the family, that's so patriarchal or whatever.
Yeah.
But how is that actually, what's the proper understanding of that, and how do we live that out?
Well, of course, that comes, it's scriptural, right? It's St. Paul in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21 and on, right? But notice what verse 21 says, and it doesn't in any way change what you just said, right? Husbands and wives, be submissive to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then we go into the classic, every husband and wife, right, elbows one another, right? Wives be at the wedding, or and never preaches about on Sunday, right? Husbands and wives be submissive to one another, reverence for Christ. And then wives, be submissive to your husband as to the Lord. St. Paul continues, right, and talks about the role of the husband, right? To be another Christ, to lay down his life, right? So the reason why the wife can be submissive to her husband as to the Lord is precisely because the husband recognizes that his existence is and purpose and vocation is wrapped up in making a sincere gift of self to his spouse, to be another Christ, to be an ipsu Christus, to be an alter Christus, right? For his bride, for his family. So practically speaking, so that's the teaching, right? It's a mutual submissiveness. But there is, in a sense, an order in that. And we're called, really, who in St. Paul, who has the harder deal, right? I mean, we're called to be to our lives on a cross, right? That's what we're called to be as men. And it's actually through his humility and through gift of self that we, do that. In terms of how not to see it, there was this movie when I was a youngster, was it My Big Fat Greek Wedding, and it popularized, I guess it's a Greek phrase, I'm not even sure, like the husband is the head, but the wife is the neck. And I think that gets it all wrong. I really do, because that's still thinking in terms of the power paradigm, right, of marriage. It's not about power. It's about that self gift, that mutual submission to one another out of reverence for Christ. So I would say leave that, the neck analogy, that neck metaphor, and behind. But you hear it all the time, and then people joke about it. It's kind of funny and you laugh. But if you actually believe it, it actually can be quite problematic, right? Because it's about power play instead of something.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? In our home, it's probably pretty traditional. And each couple, each family has to discern the right way to exercise this in their home. But in our home, if I'm definitely the leader, and my bride is so virtuous, right? And that she allows me to be that leader, and allows me, for good or ill, right, to exercise that role that has been given to me as God, by God. So, in decision making, we always consult with one another, right, on big decisions. But in theory, if there was a disagreement, at the end of the day, I have to make a decision for our family, So you can think of like big decisions in terms of work, for example, right? I've got a new job, but it requires moving the family. Well, at the end of the day, in our home, I would have the freedom, right, ultimately to make the final decision if we, for that.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I better be taking her thoughts and her feelings and her experience and her reflections into serious consideration. If I'm only thinking of my career and the next career move, I'm making a big mistake as a husband. And so it's done in consultation with one another. But ultimately I do have to make a decision, and in our home we recognize that is my role. But that's going to be exercised differently in every home, of course, and each family, every couple has different charisms and different gifts to do so. But we have to always uphold that reality. I mean, the father is called to be the spiritual leader of his home.
Mm-hmm.
Ands or buts about it. There's nothing sexist about that. There's nothing, demeaning to women when I say that. But it's a God-given responsibility and duty that I have to be that spiritual leader, to lead my family as Saint Joseph did, to protect them, to guide them, and to be willing to lay down my very life for the sake of my family.
Yes, that's so good. Yeah, I've often thought of headship and leadership as the man who be the first to sacrifice yourself, be the first to lay down your life, and then the woman comes under that and reciprocates. But you are responsible for being the first to be that living sacrifice. And I just love hearing your story and your ways of living that out is really incredible. One last question here. What I've often heard this from newlyweds actually this past year is just, man, the graces of the sacrament are so real is something that they'll say. And I would love to hear from you as being married for a longer time and having 8 kids, the 9th on the way. How have you experienced the graces of the sacrament on a daily or just in your life in general, in your vocation? And what does that even mean?
Yeah, man, that's a challenging one, Eric. So, I mean, I've never thought in those terms, and so I am thinking off the cuff here, as I answer your question. My first and natural one is just to kind of chuckle inside, like if you knew me and all of my faults, and all the ways in which I fall short of being the saint I'm called to be, I think there would be no question at all that the graces of the sacrament work, right?
Yeah.
There's in our lives, in our marriages. And I imagine many of us can say that, like that's probably why we think that, like, gosh, I know that I fall short, and yet here we are, we have a beautiful marriage and a beautiful family. So I think that's a first thing. Golly, I mean, we're called to a particular vocation, and God would call us to that vocation if he were not going to support us in that by giving us the grace necessary to live it well. And so the key thing in all of this is remaining always fundamentally open to what his grace is trying to do in and on us, right? So that means, again, a connection to the sacraments, right? And making sure we're receiving that sanctifying grace in the sacraments. It means especially communion of Eucharist and in the sacrament of confession of penance, but also of regularly seeking the actual graces, right? There's 2 kinds of grace: sanctifying grace and there's actual grace. Actual grace is that kind of grace that we, in a difficult moment, we ask for supernatural help. Like, help me here to be patient. Help me here to be kind. Help me here to be loving. Help me to do the right thing, right? It's in those moments where we seek his grace. So while he gives us grace kind of permanently, right, to live out our vocation, I think constantly being tied to that sanctifying as well as actual grace and seeking that out helps us to live out our marriage well. And he will equip you to become I have absolute confidence in that. He will equip you to become what you are, to become what you are called to be that school of love, to be that school of virtue, to be the domestic church he made you to be. And so maybe in a lot of ways, it's just simply having that conviction and that recognition and that acknowledgement of how much we depend upon his grace, and then seeing it and being grateful for that grace in our lives, being grateful for the ways in which he operates in our marriage and in our family. The last thought I'd have on that is I think of Venerable Fulton Sheen's book. It's called 3 to Get Married, or that was the title, at least that when I read it, 3 to Get Married. And that idea has always been very appealing to me. Again, it's not just about you and your spouse, right? But recognizing that God is there, and he is present and he is active in our lives, in our marriages. And if we remember that, and remember that ultimately the whole reason for the thing, right? The whole reason for marriage that we are entering into isn't about your own self-fulfillment. It isn't about your own joy and being tickled and to have fun, even though all of those things, God willing, hopefully will happen. But ultimately it is about salvation, about pursuing God with your whole mind, your whole heart, your entire person. And you do that through marriage. So yeah, my experience is definitely that he gives us, even though I haven't, as I told you, always thought in those terms, he gives us the grace to live this thing well, and will continue to do so as we do well and as we struggle in marriage and family life, and constantly turning to him and asking for his grace and his assistance, I think is a great way to make sure that we have a strong and beautiful marriage that evangelizes the culture and that ultimately will get us all to heaven.
That is incredible. Well, Arland, thank you so much for sharing, for coming on the podcast. And lastly, if people want to get connected, if they want to do the Together in Holiness conference and then the groups, the formation groups, how do people get involved? How do people help find what's going on there?
Sure. So if you're interested in the Together in Holiness formation series or conference series for that matter, go to togetherinholiness.org. So Together in Holiness, all combined, .org. And that's where you can submit an inquiry about the formation series, and start a process of discerning with us if you might be called to have one of these small circles of like-minded couples. For the organization as a whole, if you're interested in just learning more about what we do, or you heard about one of our other initiatives and you're interested in that, or just want to stay connected, our website is forlifeandfamily.org. So forlifeandfamily.org or togetherinholiness.org, and that'll get you there.
All right. Well, thanks, Arland.
Thank you, Eric.